Welcome back to another episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today's guest is Charlie Engle. Charlie is one of the premier adventure athletes in the world today. He's run across more than 40 countries, but by far his most important accomplishment is his 30 years of clean and sober living. His best-selling book, Running Man, was published by Simon and Schuster in 2016, and Charlie's record-setting run across the Sahara Desert led to the creation of H2O Africa, which is known today as water.org, co-founded by Matt Damon. Charlie has been a featured speaker at the United Nations, at NATO Headquarters in Belgium, and on board at the USS Carl Vinson aircraft carrier. He regularly trains Fortune 500 companies in strategies for resilience and addressing mental health issues. So let's get this conversation going and welcome Charlie Engle to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Charlie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. There's a lot of parallels in our stories, and I love what you're doing now. I love how you're helping people improve their health, thrive in recovery, and you've just achieved some incredible things on a personal level, on a physicality level, and you're just kind of a freak of nature. You're about, as we're recording this, to run 30 hours this weekend to celebrate 30 years of sobriety. Congrats to you on that. But I know things haven't always been easy for you. You've had a lot of adversity in your life, whether it be spending time in federal prison, whether it be drug addiction, or just in that place, that rock bottom moment where there was like shots fired at your car and police was involved. I want to go back though. I want to go back to your days at University of North Carolina where your addiction kind of began. What was going on in your mind? What was going on in your life? And what do you think, looking back now, what led you into that addiction?
Now, flashing forward, I have the knowledge of understanding the power of genetics in addiction. I'm basically a fifth, generation addict alcoholic. And so while that's not the only reason, it certainly is, a factor, my just sort of my makeup, the way I was born. But when I was in high school, it's a bit of an overachiever, like a lot of people. And I played a lot of sports and I made good grades, and I was student body president at a high school that was a very big high school that was predominantly black. And I was the first white student body president in the history of my high school. And, I thought I was a badass is what that all boils down to. And I get to college at UNC Chapel Hill, and in pretty short order, I discovered I was incredibly average. Because everybody else, there's 4,000 other freshmen there. They basically all have the same or better resume that I did. And the drinking age was still 18 when I went to college in North Carolina. And I found that I was an incredibly good drinker in air quotes, right? Because I could just simply drink more than anybody else. And that quickly became my identity. It became a thing that I just did and was almost expected to do. And I got lost pretty quickly. And I survived a few years at college. Crazy as it is, I ended up playing basketball at the University of North Carolina for a little bit. Certainly not on the varsity team, but on the JV team. And Roy Williams was my coach. And I was there with guys like Michael Jordan and James Worthy back in the early 80s. And I got to play with these guys every day. And to be honest, that probably prolonged my time in college for a little while. But when that ended, the slide happened fast, man. And when you go a whole semester without going to class, as crazy as it is, they actually ask you to leave.
Wow. Gosh, what a start to your story, man. And this is what's really fascinating to you is you had so much going for you. You mentioned that you were a great athlete, you were a good kid, you were a likable guy, you played around some of the most incredible basketball players of all time, but yet you still kind of fell down this slippery slope of addiction. And I think in college, there's probably a lot of quote unquote functioning alcoholics, right? Because they're going out, they're drinking every night, but they're still making it to class, they're still making it to their commitments. And it really never evolves into anything deeper than that because their life doesn't start to fall apart. When did that start to really take a turn for you? What age were you? I know your dad had to get involved. What was going on at that time?
Yeah, dude, you nailed it right there. I was baffled by the fact. I mean, the cocaine, as I like to call it, was the '80s were the cocaine decade, and not that way now, probably, but then it was ubiquitous on campus. I mean, it was maybe like weed is today. Like there was never I never went anywhere on campus where there wasn't Coke. And I don't think I realized it was illegal. You know, it just seemed like a thing that everyone did. The difference is once I started, you know, you wouldn't see me for 2 days or however long I could make, you know, the drugs or my meager bank account last. Other guys would quit at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and they'd get up and go to class the next day. And, you know, they were just partying. And I'm not condoning or condemning or anything. That's just the way they did it. And I couldn't do it that way. I mean, from the very beginning, the moment I drank the first beer, it was not going to end until there was either no more alcohol and drugs, no more access to it for me, you know, or I just, you know, ran the clock out and finally passed out or something. I mean, there just was never a time for me where that wasn't. And I didn't understand looking at other people how they were able to, you know, with general guidelines, they were able to control it. I never was.
Right. And do you think looking back now, like you mentioned that you took like the first drink or even like when you were doing coke and you knew it just wasn't going to stop with just the bare minimum, it was going to go all night. Like, was it because you just loved like the euphoric feeling of what it did for you, or were you in a time like maybe battling some issues with inside of you about like what was going to happen after college, or maybe different athletic endeavors that you thought you were going to fulfill that didn't get done? Like what was going through your mind at that time where it made those substances feel so good?
Man, I would love to say I was so deep that I was worried about things beyond college. I had no, I wasn't even able to do that. You know, I really believe, I tell a story in my book early on where, you know, I grew up in this very bohemian way with my mother, only child. And like, I like to say that I was lovingly neglected at my house. And, you know, my mom was 18 when I was born and she was a kid. And there was never anything to eat or drink in the house. And I mean, not like we were starving to death, but you know, it was just it was a minimalist lifestyle. And I remember, you know, picking up a half finished beer at a party that was at my house and drinking that when I was 9 or 10 years old. And it's not that I drank every day after that, but it's like alcohol made me feel warm and safe, and I was in a very insecure situation, but it made me feel safe. And from that day on, I mean, it's like alcohol planted a flag in my brain and claimed that territory for itself. And I always knew it would be there for me. And so, you know, years later, I'm in college and I'm lost. I'm just lost. Like everybody else knows how to study. You know, a lot of people relate to this, I think. I was smart enough in high school to not have to really work all that hard to make good grades. And, you know, when you go to college, especially a place like UNC, like you actually have to go to the library and crack a book and do some. I didn't know how to do that. Like I just had been winging it and I was undisciplined, terrified. You know, my father was the kind of guy who never came to any of my games. You know, it didn't matter if I made straight A's. If there was an A minus in there, that's all he focused on. You know, I wanted to please him. And I recognized very, very quickly in college that was not going to happen. I was not going to be a standout in any way in college. So I knew it was only a matter of time before I was going to leave college and just have to get on with whatever was going to be my life.
You mentioned that alcohol for you became like this thing where it made you feel good, right? And you kind of planted your flag with alcohol even from an early age. And you see a lot of kids now, they join a fraternity, they join a sorority, and then they end up graduating college, and that fraternity or sorority like lifestyle ends up going with them after college, and they're out at happy hours 5, 6, 7 nights a week. They're drinking with their friends, and that carries on. Then you see a percentage of those people either in rehab for alcohol or they turn to other substances and become addicted to them. Like, do you think that's a problem now in schools, like looking back and working with the people that you do now and through all your experience, is that this party lifestyle in college just shouldn't be for everyone and there should be more talk about it?
Totally believe that. Yes. And I mean, I was in a fraternity, which, it's not their fault, but, it gave me ample opportunity to live the lifestyle that I ultimately, did live. And I'm not close friends with any of those guys, really. I'm friends with a number of them, but I would say the most interesting piece to that is I had a little group of probably 6 guys that I drank and drugged with a lot. And, when I know we're gonna get to this, but when I finally quit using, I had some of them coming to me saying, you don't need to quit. You just need to slow down. You need to slow down. I'm like, have you been watching me? Right? I mean, if I could have slowed down, I would have done that a long time ago. And it took me a long time to understand that even the people who love and support us the most in our lives sometimes it's like they've got us on a rope and they want to pull us back, and it's not that they don't want us to be successful, but they're more concerned with how our success is going to make them feel. So interestingly, a lot of these guys went on to great careers. They're making money. They're drinking and drugging their lives away every single day. My, lack of money, but sober lifestyle that I learned very early to live very publicly became more attractive to them. And one by one, well, 2 of those guys died and 3 of them called me eventually and said, how do I do this? And I think that it is, though, in college today, a lot of lip service is paid to services on campus and trying to stop binge drinking, and in the Greek system, trying to, create limitations. But, teenagers, as I was, as you were, we're the most creative people on the planet, and we will always get around something if that's what we're determined to do. So, I honestly don't know what the answer is. The answer is, in my view, people are going to take the path they're going to take. And the most important thing is to let them know very publicly that you don't have to stay on this path. Anytime you want to step off of it, there's help for you. And when I was in college in the early 80s, there was no such thing. I actually literally did. There was nowhere to turn. There was no campus service for addiction or alcoholism or anything like that. So, when things really went south for me, the only alternative was, as you mentioned, a fraternity brother actually called my father, which I still say to this day is maybe the bravest thing anybody's ever done for me. He called my father and said, hey, Charlie's in trouble. You need to come get him. I mean, I was already going to get kicked out of school because I hadn't gone to class for an entire semester, and I was going to get arrested. I was going to die. Something was going to happen. But that was the only alternative back then. Now I think there's if people will use them, there's pretty good services on campuses.
Right. And I think it's hard too for these kids because there's a lot that goes into it. It's not just that they stop drinking. You brought this up. It's like their identity becomes so entwined in this, right? That it becomes almost like a religion. They don't know like how to get out of it. And then actually their identity and the community of people that they've hung out with for a period of time becomes more addicting than the alcohol was. Plus they feel this sense of shame that it's like why can't I drink responsibly like my friends? Like why can't I have a good time like the 30 other guys that I'm partying with on the weekends and not end up like staying up, 24 hours, 48 hours, just drinking all the time. And then that becomes hard to stop because you're just always, it's like you're playing catch up, trying to get back to the beginning and being like, all right, I just want to start over and figure out how I can do this in a responsible way. And as you know, it just never works out. But things didn't stop there for you. I mean, you went through another like decade of addiction, but you were functioning. I mean, you were successful in your job. You got married. What did the day-to-day look like for you as I guess a quote unquote functioning addict? And then when did things start to take a turn for the worse in your adult life where things started to fall apart?
Yeah, I spent, when I left college, I basically spent 10 years. I was 20 years old, 21 years old when I left, but I was deep into my addiction at that point, but I spent, the next 9 years repeating a very familiar pattern to many people. I would move to a new city. I'd get a job. I was going to say a good job. I don't know if they were good jobs. They were all in sales. So, I sold fitness memberships, but instead of just selling them, I became the number one salesperson in a chain of 20 fitness clubs and actually started up there in Maryland. It used to be called Bally's back in the day. So, in Rockville, Maryland was the home. So not that far from you, but my way of sort of proving that I didn't have a problem to myself and anybody around me was to be the top sales guy. So I would move, I'd get the job, I'd kick some ass for 6 months, I'd celebrate, because of course I deserve to celebrate after working hard and proving myself again. And that celebration would eventually lead me right down the rabbit hole again, and I would piss it all away, lose the job, lose the girl, lose the apartment, be embarrassed, and literally decide, okay, I'm going to Los Angeles now and I'm going to start over and I'm going to do it differently this time. And every time, of course, I meant it. And as you know, and a lot of people listening to this, the common theme though is I took one thing with me everywhere I went. And that was me. If I could have only left myself behind, maybe I could have successfully changed. But that pattern, I thought if I could be the top salesperson, get married, buy a house, buy a car, clearly addicts don't do that. I mean, that's how I felt in my 20s. Like, can't possibly be an addict. And, that did fall apart when I was about 26 and I went to rehab. But even that, it's not that I made a mess of it, but I viewed rehab the same as I viewed everything else. I viewed it like a challenge to be won, and that I wanted to be the best. Like my goal was to be the best person that ever went through rehab. And what that meant to me was, of course, raising my hand, asking all the right questions, attending everything. And I'm not saying it wasn't in my heart. Like I wanted to change, but I wanted to do it in a way that made me shine somehow. My ego was so fragile and I was so insecure still that I didn't get it. I needed to be recognized as better at sobriety than other people. And I was so wrong-headed, but it took what it took. I stayed sober 6 months that time and drank on the 6-month anniversary and spent the next, 3 years smoking crack and drinking. And, I like to point out, I love to say this anytime because sometimes it's parents or loved ones of an addict who are listening to this podcast. People feel like they waste their money and they waste their time. If someone goes to rehab and they pay however much money, usually a lot of money, to send somebody to rehab and then they relapse, it's a waste of money. It's not a waste of money. It's a step along the path. It really is it's not like the story of Sisyphus. The ball is getting pushed up the mountain and even on a relapse, it doesn't fall all the way to the bottom. It does fall, but it stops here because there's a level of learning that happens each time when somebody takes that step, and hopefully they get closer and closer to the top and being able to stay there. And that's what happened for me. I kind of just kept coming back. About my final episode with gunshots and police and everything else. And, for whatever reason, that time ended up being enough for me.
What happened in that moment, like in that rock bottom point in your life? Like, if you could just explain to the listeners or people watching this, like what exactly was going on that night?
I had a company. I, of course, designed a company because that's another thing that addicts are brilliant at, that allowed me complete freedom. I traveled the country following hailstorms, of all things. And I was making a lot of money, so I always had cash in my pocket. And it was 2 months after the birth of my son. And I thought he was going to change things because I was desperately looking for someone else to save me. Like that's what I really wanted, for almost like somebody to force me into sobriety because I didn't have the courage to do it for myself. And this particular incident was 2 months after his birth. He and his mom came and visited me in Wichita, Kansas. And we had an amazing week together where I felt love for this little boy that I didn't know I was capable of, and love from him. And I drive them to the airport in Wichita and wave goodbye and kiss them goodbye. And I drive straight to the hood and I spend 6 days smoking crack. Nothing happened. Nothing. There was no catalyst. We didn't have an argument. Everything was great, but something triggered in me. And that binge ended with me sitting on the ground outside a dumpy motel, watching the police search my car. 3 bullet holes in the back were put there by somebody, shooting at me, not my car. And I'll remember this cop digging through the bottles and cans and all the crap in the back. And he reaches under the driver's seat and pulls out a crack pipe like magic, like a magic trick. And I'm watching this cop, and, anybody remotely sane would have been thinking, oh shit, I'm in some serious trouble. Like this is going to be bad, right? I mean, I'm going to jail, whatever. And all I could think is like, so that's where that was. Because, I had looked, as any addict knows what I'm talking about. I'd looked for that pipe for like 2 days. Man, I had searched high and low. I knew it was somewhere, and I hid it from myself. And I knew in that moment that, nobody was coming to save me. My son couldn't save me. There was no saving me until I was willing to take the first real step and turn myself over to this. When I had gone to rehab a few years earlier, the piece that I was unwilling to accept was any form of spirituality or higher power or anything else. Sometimes people talk about religion. I wasn't even that. It was because, as we know, AA is not a religious program, despite what people want to say. But I saw it that way, and I wanted no part of any of it. And my unwillingness to accept that I wasn't actually the greatest, power on earth kept me drinking and drugging for those extra years. And finally, that night in Wichita, I was willing to let all of that go and do anything that was necessary to change my life.
Super inspiring, and you're lucky to be alive, and you were lucky, I guess, not to go to jail at that point too, right? And that, somehow that was your greatest setback in that moment has become your biggest blessing. And I know that running has been transformational, to say the least, in your recovery, and has been like the fundamental thing in your life over the last 30 years that has kept you mentally stable, sober, all the things. How did you get started using running for your sobriety, and why has it been so important for you to keep up with it?
Yeah, Doug, I had been a runner in high school, and a pretty good one. And even during my decade of addiction, and maybe you can relate to this, I used running as a mechanism to clean up from time to time. Because, I would go off the rails for a month or 6 months or whatever it was. And eventually I'd hit a point where I'm like, okay, that's it. I quit, like every addict has done. And and for a little while I could do that. Like it might be a week or a month, but I would use running as a way to help me physically recover, and also to just make me feel good. I figured out very early on that endorphin release and what came to me from running was critical for me. So when I did that night in Wichita, I went to a meeting that night, and the next morning I got up and put on my running shoes and went for a very short, painful 2 mile awful run. But I committed to do those two things every day for 30 days. I went to a meeting and I ran every day for 30 days. And at the end of 30 days, my life had actually gotten, markedly better. And so I said, okay, I'm going to keep going for 90 days. Did it for 90. Ultimately, 3 years later, I hadn't missed a day. I ran and I went to a meeting every day for 3 straight years. And I prioritized those things because I felt like my life depended on it. And I think it really did. And look, I ran like a maniac. I mean, I freely admit, I had friends saying, oh, all you did was switch addictions. You used to be this guy and now all you do is run. And I took that as criticism. I heard it as somebody digging at me that I still wasn't good enough. And I actually believe that was partially true, because people always want to find fault. with other people. It's the weirdest thing. But I think what I was trying to do, Doug, was to run the addict out of me. Like I wanted to use running to like beat that dude to death. And if I could just get rid of the addict, then everything would be okay. And you can guess where this is going. What I actually learned was the addict is all the best parts of me, right? I mean, my obsessive sort of addictive nature is what makes me really good at the things that I'm passionate about. And if I can just not put drugs and alcohol in my system, I can be really successful at some of those things. And, so during those 3 years, I ran like 30 or so marathons. The joke I always make is because obviously I had that whole addiction thing under control. Moderation was not a good friend of mine. So what that taught me in those 30 years, those 30 marathons was every single marathon I did, I reached a point that I wanted to quit. Like there was never a time when I ran a marathon that I felt amazing the entire way through, because that's not the design of doing this kind of thing. But every single time I got to the place where I would say internally, I can't go on. I can't go on. That's it. I quit. Like I internally was like, I can't keep doing this. And then I found a way to get past it, like 1 second at a time, to just say, okay, just hang on another minute. Like stay right behind that guy and just stay there and don't think about the pain. Like keep going. Every time that happened, it made me more capable to do that kind of thing in the other parts of my life. So every time I wanted to drink or use, every time I wanted to quit my job or leave my marriage or whatever it was, I knew if I would just let a minute pass by and I would just keep moving forward, that things would get better. That lesson taught me well. And being the good addict that I am too, I recognize that if a marathon makes me feel a certain way, how would I feel if I ran 50 miles or 100 miles or hundreds of miles? And I started to run really long events, 100-mile plus ultra marathons all over the world. And, I won a lot of races, and I began to discover that I sort of loved going to that controlled edge where everything else was taken away. The busy life, the relationships, everything was focused down to one thing, trying to put one foot in front of the other to keep moving towards a goal. And it's something that still speaks to me today. That's what I want to do when I go run, is move everything else out of the way for a little while and be fully focused on my body and my breath and just moving forward.
Yeah, running and fitness, I believe, are two of the most underutilized tools in recovery that there are. Like I think they should be a staple in every treatment center, no matter like what the fitness level is of somebody. There is always something they can do to move their body and help them become physically fit, which I think in turn will help them in all other areas of their lives too. You touched on like the addiction aspect of how it related to your running, that people said that it almost like felt like you switched addictions and then you kept like almost up leveling your endeavors with running. Like you started with like a marathon and then you would do like the 50 milers, 100 milers. Like, have you ever found that to be like kind of detrimental in the sense where you felt like you did a race and it didn't feel as good as you thought it would?
Yes. And actually, that happened to me during those 30 marathons. I can give you a great example of that, of exactly what you're saying. And I do think that once this thing happened to me that I'm going to describe to you, everything else became, gravy after that. Vegan gravy, by the way. I was trying to break 3 hours. So any marathon runner knows that you probably, if you run enough marathons, you end up kind of having a time goal. Like I don't recommend it for people starting out. Just focus on having the experience and get to the finish line. But competitively, I wanted to see if I could break 3 hours. And I kept coming close, like 5 or 6 marathons in a row. I ran 3:01, 3:02, and I would always fall apart at the end of the race and not quite make it. And I basically destroyed the experience for myself. I was so caught up in the outcome that I ruined the experience by basically just saying, okay, that was a terrible race because I ran, 3:02 instead of 2:59:59. And like that was a hard lesson for me because my son, who was 2 or 3 years old at the time, is the one who sort of he made me laugh after one race in San Diego where I ran 3:02 and I'm carrying him on my shoulders. And anybody who has kids knows this scenario I'm going to describe. He's tapping me on the head, like he's on my shoulders. And I'm talking to my wife and I'm complaining. I'm just going on and on. Well, it was windy in the second half and there were two hills and I just didn't do well. And then this guy did that and here's what happened. And like, I'm just bitching basically and making all the excuses. And my son is tapping me on the head over and over. Daddy, daddy, daddy. Like we've all done it. We've all seen it. We've all had it done if you have kids. And I'm like, what? Like, not very nice. Hopefully nobody else heard me. And my son's like, why didn't you just run a little faster? And I mean, literally, I laughed so friggin' hard because of, he boiled it all down to this like tiny little thing. But and obviously, if I'd have been able to run faster, I would have. But it reminded me that I had taken all the joy out of the experience for myself and that I think this translates to almost everything. And I have to focus on not letting it happen even today after 30 years sober. We get so attached to outcomes and we see this thing that we want to achieve and we back into how we're going to get there and we find all the hurdles along the way. And whether we get there or not, we kind of end up sucking out the joy from the journey. I hate cliches, but it is the journey. It is all the steps along the way that actually matter. Assuming I don't relapse this week, on Saturday, July 23rd, I'll have 30 years of sobriety. Reaching that day is going to be extremely anticlimactic because it's fairly pointless without all the days that led up to it and the experiences that I had. And I keep that in mind, and running really taught me that. I have to tell you too, Doug, I don't even, when I'm speaking to an audience, I usually get them to raise their hands. Like I say, who here hates running? And 90% of the audience will raise their hand every time. I don't care if it's 10 people or 1,000. And I always make the joke that they don't hate running. We as kids, when we're 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, you can't stop us from running. Like running is pure joy. Like you just see it, like movement and your body and that joy. And then like some middle school teacher, PE teacher uses running as a punishment. And all of a sudden running is no longer fun and people spend the rest of their lives like hating the joy that comes from physical movement. And so part of my mission, and you said it a minute ago, is to get in the treatment world, especially if someone is physically capable of moving, physical movement should be compulsory while you're in rehab, because that's a tangible activity that you can take with you out into the real world when you inevitably go back probably to the same environment which used to get you drunk. And if you don't have tools, and physical tools are so important in being able to get past danger times.
Yeah. I mean, you're so right, man. And I think that if people can just embrace the fact that they don't have to like run as far as the person next to them or their neighbor or everyone else, they only need to run or walk as far as they're able, I think they'll really find the joy in running or walking. And it's not just the physical benefits. It's like like we've talked about, as a theme, like the mental and emotional benefits that come with this, where it helps you get through a tough thing like addiction, right? And it helps you kind of use that pain and turn it into some sort of purpose. And it helps you take a lot of this negative emotional baggage that's pent up inside of us because of the years or decades of self-destruction, and help us use that to channel it into something positive and meaningful. And it'd be great if right now we could say, all right, podcast over, you've like turned your life around and things have been super easy along the way, and you're going to run this race this weekend, you're going to celebrate 30 years of sobriety. But we know that's not the case. You had something unfortunate happen a little over 10 years ago, and you found yourself in prison. What was going through, like, first of all, like what happened? And then second of all, like what was going through your mind being somebody that at this point you had like nearly 20 years of sobriety and you had turned your life around. What was going on then? And then how did you use your prison experience to transform your life even more?
Look, backing into a little, I'll keep this super brief, but my running led me to this crazy project. I was the senior producer for a TV show called Extreme Makeover Home Edition for years. So I'm 12 or 13 years sober and life had gotten measurably better. I end up coming up with this idea to run across the Sahara Desert and that was a good idea. And I managed to convince Matt Damon and some other high level folks to join me in this project. And I end up running with two teammates all the way across the Sahara, the first person to run all the way across Africa. And I ran nearly 5,000 miles. And it was a film called Running the Sahara. And I ran 2 marathons every single day for 111 consecutive days. And it was arguably one of the hardest physical things anyone's ever done. And I co-founded water.org, which is today the world's largest clean water nonprofit with Matt Damon. And, my life was good. And this is 2008, 9. I did another run across the US, made a second film. The day that movie premiered, I was living in Greensboro, North Carolina. I ran some errands the next day, exhausted after a big experience the night before, screening the film with 350 people, mostly friends. I come back to my condo and 6 armed federal agents come out of a coffee shop in my building and they have their guns drawn. They arrest me, put me in the back of a police car, take me to jail. I don't know what's going on. This is news to me, like all of it. I stay there for the night. The next morning, I'm handed a stack of papers that's a federal indictment. And in interest of time, let's just say I became the first person in the United States and only person at the time to be charged with overstating my income on a home loan application. And for that, I could be sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. And look, you read the book. I mean, I'm not trying to sell books, but feel free. My Audible book I'm happy to say, has done extremely well. So you can get it on Audible. It's called Running Man. I go into more detail, but in short, I had enough notoriety from running the Sahara, Jay Leno's show, all the morning news shows. I had my 15 minutes of fame, right? I was that guy for a minute, but I didn't have any money. Ultra running is not the place to go if you're trying to make money. And so, I was the perfect target in 2010 at the tail end of the mortgage crisis. The administration was looking for people to blame. I had just enough notoriety to be interesting. I ended up on the front page of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, every paper in the country. And overnight, I'm booted off the board of all my nonprofits. I lose every sponsor. I lost 35 speaking gigs, and I was getting paid a fair amount of money for these speaking gigs. And like my whole life was stripped away. And I go to trial. And interestingly, I'm found not guilty of providing false information on a loan application because I hadn't. Mortgage broker that I used admitted at trial that he forged a loan document, signed my name to it. One would think that's it, man. End of story. But I signed the closing package, right? Put my name on it, put it in the mail to the closing attorney, and it included that forged document. Didn't matter if I knew it was there or not. I owned it once I signed it. I get convicted of mail fraud and I go to prison for 21 months. I'm sentenced to 21 months in Beckley, West Virginia. And Valentine's Day 2011, my kids literally dropped me off at the front gates of prison. And, worst summer camp ever. And, we're all in tears and crying, and I'm really pissed off. I'm scared. I'm a little scared and I'm sad about what's going on, but I am really angry about, as I see it, what has been done to me, right? Because that's still the headspace that I'm in. Like, how could this happen to me? This is so unfair. Dude, I get there, and you know this story because you got some experience in this space. I get there, and first guy that shows me around, I'm in a low security prison. He shows me around. His name is Pick and Roll. Pick and Roll is like, I still don't know his real name even today, but Pick and Roll is like, so Engle, what's your bid? And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. Because I didn't know any of even the language. He's like, how long will you be here? I'm like, 21 months. He's like, shit, that's not even long enough to unpack your bags. Right. So, I mean, I'm talking to a guy who got a 26-year sentence for a single gram of crack cocaine. A black man, 26 years, 1 gram of crack cocaine after two, shoplifting charges. Like, you want to talk about unfair? I got my ass handed to me on day one from a perspective standpoint. And from that day on, I understood that my happiness was still completely up to me. I wasn't going to make it in there if I was angry and bitter. And the only way through for me was going to be to decide, who I was going to be in this situation. Fair or unfair no longer mattered. It didn't matter. I was going to be there, in the federal system. You're going to do 85% of your sentence, period. There's no early release or anything like that. So I had to figure out what I was going to do with the next year and a half of my life.
Damn, man. I mean, I can't imagine how much pain, anger, sadness, heartbreak, everything that you were going through at that time in your life. And then to go into prison and make the most of it, I think is incredibly admirable given the circumstances and also like how far you had come in your life, and then to have something like that happen. I mean, a lot of people, it could have been just the end. It's like, you know what? Like, I'm done. I've worked this hard to come this far. Like, this is it. I can't do this again. And I'm just giving up. A lot of people, Charlie, have never been and will never go to like physical prison. But there's plenty of people that every single day they live in some sort of mental prison. And I think a big part of the battle, like you said, is being able to manage that mental prison when you're inside something like physical prison. What were some of the things that you did on a daily basis in there that really improved your self-worth, your self-esteem, your level of confidence to help you battle the mental prison that you were in?
I want to point out one thing before I answer that question that you can relate to, right? My 20s, I did a lot of drugs. I sold drugs, I had drugs, I did drugs. So some would say, well, you deserve to go to prison back then, and this is just, life's wheel turning and blah blah blah. And while I see some logic to that, I would also say, and you know this, I was in prison with like 80% of the guys in federal prison were there for nonviolent drug charges. It's such an unbelievable waste of humanity and taxpayer dollars. And people think that, oh, tough on crime, this is the way we're going to stop this. And I say to people regularly, okay, take any person, black or white, but in particular, if you're a person of color, give them a felony at 20 years old. They go to prison for 2 years, 10 years, whatever it is. They get out with that felony. They can't get a job. They can't get a decent job, right? They can't, like, they've got this F tattooed on them for felon for the rest of their lives. Who do you think pays for that? Taxpayers. And I remind my tough on crime friends, I'm like, you understand, like, that person's going to be on public assistance probably for maybe the rest of his life. So you're not teaching him a lesson with a prison sentence because he sold some weed to somebody. You're now taking responsibility for paying him extra money for the rest of his life and putting him in public housing and whatever else forever. So as a taxpayer, a diversionary program makes for nonviolent drug offenses, makes huge sense. So that's one thing I learned in there is, I expected the people in prison to be like scary and dangerous. And sure, I'm not saying there's not some of that, but in general, just friggin' people, man. And most of them were just addicts who got caught with dope and end up getting sent to prison to continue the prison industrial complex because it's politicians and, people paying money to politicians to keep the thing the same way. Anyway, that was my stump speech. Sorry. So now I forgot the question.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And I think it's important for people to kind of understand that like putting drug addicts in prison like isn't really helping them. There's no rehabilitation that goes on there when they're in prison.
You get worse in prison. if anything.
Right. And that's the norm for a lot of people. But for you, going back to my question, you became a better person when you got out of prison. So, like, what did you do on a daily basis?
Yeah, dude. So you know what I did is the only thing I knew how to do. I ran. And that is an interesting thing about going to prison. You have a lot of time on your hands and you have to figure out what to do with it. So first thing I did actually was run, right? So every day we had a little rec yard. There's about 500 men in this prison, and we had a rec yard with a softball field, basketball court, and what I call a goat path around the rec yard. So I just started running every day. And I'm not kidding when I say there were no runners in this prison. Like, there were a few walkers, a couple guys would jog a lap here and there, but there wasn't anybody else in there I'd consider like a runner. And I just ran every day. And when we were in lockdown, I would run in my cell. I would run in place sometimes for 6 or 7 hours at a time. My cellmate would leave and he would he would be like, you're something is very wrong with you. And the funny part that I love to say is that, like, as a middle-aged white dude in federal prison, being considered mildly crazy wasn't actually a bad thing. It's like nobody bothered me. They were like, just like, okay, something's wrong with that guy, just leave him alone. The other thing that I did every day was journal. And I had always been a writer. I loved to write. And in sobriety, I had been a journaler. But at this point, it changed. I actually had time, disciplined time for a couple of hours every single day to sit down and, if whether it was answering letters or writing in my journal, and that really helped me. The third thing I did was, and this is maybe the most unlikely, is I started doing yoga on the softball field by myself a couple days a week. I don't, for any of you out there thinking of going to federal prison, I don't recommend that necessarily, because I took a lot of shit for that. I'm out there on the softball field doing these crazy pretzel poses that I wasn't very good at doing yoga. But, look, over time, the law of attraction rather than promotion, as we know very well in addiction recovery, really worked in my favor. I never one time went up to another inmate and said, hey, dude, you look like you could lose a few pounds. Why don't you come run with me? Because that would be a bad idea. But slowly but surely, guys started coming up to me and saying, hey, can you teach me how to run? I mean, it'd be that simple. Because honestly, they saw my life being, I don't want to say better, but they saw me happier, more productive. I started teaching addiction recovery classes. That was another thing. Because in the federal system, another short political point here, there is no addiction treatment in the federal system. You can get a 20-year sentence. You could be a hardcore drug addict. 6 months before you get out, you're required to take a drug education course. But, like, there's no treatment up to that point. So you're not getting any better. And so, I started teaching these classes that really weren't meant for drug education, but they were sort of drug education. But what I did was basically run an AA meeting. And people began to find out about it. And I'd get 30 or 40 guys coming 3 days a week, to take this class with me. And flash forward to the day I got out of prison, guys are like hugging me and thanking me for what I did for them. I ended up having a running club with 50 guys in it. Always I had 50 guys running every single day. And, it's a revolving door. There's new guys coming in, guys who finished their time getting out. But this club stayed at about 50 people for the entire time I did it, about 15 months. Took it about 3 months before this happened. I had 25 guys doing yoga with me on the softball field 3 days a week. And, they're coming and hugging me, Doug, and thanking me for what I did for them and as you know, there's not a lot of crying in prison, but unless it's like alone in your cell, I mean, it's very little like just emotional release. People are hugging me. I'm baffled because I didn't do anything for them. That was my way to get through this thing. My first sponsor said to me many years ago, he was in his 70s, when I first met him. And I mean, he passed a long time ago. He's like, to keep it, you have to give it away. I've kept that statement with me above all statements, in my life. And a matter of fact, I've got a couple tattoos. I should probably get that one tattooed somewhere. But the idea is just if you have a gift, if you have a passion, if you have something you're good at, if you're not giving it to other people freely without expectation of any return or even a thank you, why did you learn to do it? Why do you have this gift if you're not going to share it with other people? And so my way of getting through those 18 months was to write, and I wrote about half my book while I was in there. I didn't know I was writing my book. I was just journaling. But, I sat down every day and I wrote. And then the other half was just helping other people find better health. I had 10 guys who lost more than 100 pounds, in there, running with me and doing yoga with me every day. And then I got the perspective of understanding that for the rest of my life, I know those guys who are in there right now, and I know most of them don't belong there. So any opportunity I get a chance to be an advocate, for prison reform, for every administration talks a good game and nobody ever does anything. But hopefully someday, we'll change that system and stop putting nonviolent, people in prison.
What a story, Charlie. And I'm quite inspired by how you've taken multiple negatives in your life and turned them into some incredible positives, and how you not only used your time in prison to become a better version of yourself, but you used it to change the lives of others. And kind of before we close, I would love for people who are listening to this or they're watching this to learn more about what you're doing now, where to connect with you if they want to find out how to get your book and stuff like that. I mean, I know this weekend, like by the time this episode comes out, you will already have done the 30-hour fundraising event in Ashley. So good luck to you on that. But if people want to connect with you, where can they do that?
But thank you for that, because actually there will be tons of media afterwards. And even though this will come out afterwards, I think it's important that maybe people will want to look back. My website is sort of the clearinghouse for all things. So if you want to buy the book, and my website is just charlieengle.com, which you'll probably have in your show notes. And on there are all my social media connections. And I would say Instagram in general is the place that I post most things. It ends up on Facebook and LinkedIn and a little bit on Twitter. But I would say, Instagram, you can buy the book online, or of course, Amazon. It's just called Running Man. The Audible version of that has sold really well. And it's called Running Man, but it's not because I'm a runner. I was in prison and a guy yells across the rec yard. He's like, "Hey, Running Man, you don't belong in prison. You belong in an insane asylum." And so everybody gets a nickname in prison, and that's the one that stuck for me. And, so the book is, as I like to say, I'm sober by page 70. It's not a drunk-a-log. It's not I'm not dragging people down the path of my addiction forever. It's hopefully a good inspirational story that I think ultimately reminds people, Doug, that we have to share the struggle. It's exactly what you do also. If you share your struggles with people, everybody relates to struggle. Not that many people relate to success. And too often people spend all their time a little bit of time talking about, the struggles, and all the rest of their time talk about how amazing life is today. I got to tell you, after almost 30 years, my life's still hard today. I get to be present and sober for it, but there's challenges every day. But I recognize nobody cares about that. Nobody cares about me going to prison. Nobody cares about any of those things. If you could just be real. So the question was where to go. charlieengle.com. Go to ashleyaddictiontreatment.org, which is, there'll be links on my website for that too, which will tell you more if you're looking for what I think is the best place in the country to get help if you're struggling with, alcoholism or substance use disorder. Ashley's amazing. It's a nonprofit, which doesn't make it better than others, but they need to make money, but their motivation isn't paying shareholders. They are in the business of trying to help people stay clean and sober long term. And final thing I would say is just, what happens to us isn't nearly as important as what we do about it. You're a living example of that also. I hope I am. It's good and bad stuff happens to everybody, and it's how we respond to those things that actually matter.
Amen to that, man. It's not about the hand we're dealt, it's how we play the cards, as many say. So, Charlie Engle, this has been awesome. I wanted to thank you once again for coming on the show. And for those listening, what I invite you to do is to share a takeaway. Maybe it was something that Charlie said about his journey with addiction, like whether it was how he got started in it, maybe it was stuff that happened in the thick of it, or even like how he got out of it. Maybe it was something that he shared on the importance of like perspective and doing the best you can with what you have and how he survived prison. Or maybe it was something that he shared about why running has been so transformative in his life. Whatever it was, tag Charlie and tag myself because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and we'll see you next time.